Hi, welcome to another edition of Green TV. And we are very, very, very pleased to have a guest that has actually been on Green TV before. We've been doing this long enough, a couple of months, that we have a return. And I can't think of anyone I would like to bring back than Michael Mann. Michael Mann, of course, is the hockey stick scientist. He's also a researcher, professor, but mostly he is everywhere on television and radio and podcasts. And it's been so wonderful to see, because I like to say I knew Mike back before he was Michael Mann, before he was world famous, or maybe before he was as famous, put it that way. So kind of feel a little proprietary, because he was my go-to climate scientist when I was doing my radio shows many years ago, for so many years. But so much is happening lately, and the news networks are finally giving climate not enough coverage, but more certainly than it's been. And of course, since we last talked to you, Mike, COP26 has come and gone, and also Build Back Better and infrastructure. So I thought it would really make sense to come back and say, okay, where are we now since early September, I think, when we last spoke. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Betsy. It's great to be with you, as always.
Thank you. So what do you think in terms of COP26? I guess that's the obvious place to start. Were you there, by the way? It seemed like you had that same background, like maybe you were doing all those interviews from home, which probably gave you a better sense of what was happening there, being able to cover it all virtually. I know I tried.
Yeah, I actually didn't relish the idea of going off to Glasgow in the era of COVID. We're still not quite past the threat of the pandemic, the extra carbon footprint that comes from a round trip to Europe, and the fact that there weren't even apparently enough hotel rooms for all the people who were in the city. So it was actually far more efficient for me to just stay where I was, follow things from afar, and weigh in through interviews and commentaries and the rest. So yeah, I was able to follow along and be part of the conversation without actually going there, which is sort of nice.
Yeah, emissions free. And at first there were, leading up to it in the weeks and months, expectations, as there should be, very high. This is make or break. This is our last real COP. And there was a lot of excitement, tens of thousands of people there participating, attending. And then right in the last couple of days before, John Kerry was one who was diminishing expectations and saying, especially when Russia and China were no-shows. And then there was a sense of disappointment before it really even got underway. That's a pattern I've noticed, you probably have too. But then things started to shift, and we really started to see some outcomes. So tell us, what was your ride through this in terms of hope, optimism, pessimism, or maybe you're a scientist, maybe you don't go with those emotions, I don't know. But what was your impressions as it was unfolding? Because it felt like a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, well, I'm a scientist, but also, as you know, spend a lot of time talking about the science and its implications and trying to communicate that to the public. And I'm cognizant of the fact that it's always important to weigh in with a combination of urgency and agency. Urgency without a path forward, without agency, leads us nowhere. And so it's important to recognize both the monumental challenge that we face and the need for more progress than we made, with the fact that we did make some real progress, and every bit of progress we make makes the planet better off, makes us better off. It's not all or nothing. Too many people look at this as a binary, as if we don't get everything that was on our wish list, it's a total failure. And frankly, I think that sort of messaging is unhelpful. It actually plays to the agenda of the fossil fuel interests, who would like to see us inactive. They don't care about the path that we take to inaction and disengagement. They just care about the destination. And if doom and gloom and a sort of irrational belief that no progress is being made at all leads us to disengagement, well, then they profit from that. So it's important.
Subject of your new book, the latest book.
It's the subject of the new climate war, but we very much saw this sort of tussle playing out in Glasgow, where there were some people who declared it dead on arrival before it even started. And it's true, there were some frustrations early on the first week. I actually wrote an op-ed about it in the LA Times with my colleague, Susan Joy Hassel, that ran a little more than a week ago. And it was really about, the slow start and the challenges and the frustrations that young people especially felt, that first week when it just didn't feel like there was anything happening, and how things sort of shifted when we got into that second week and we started to see the results of diplomacy, not just the big speeches given by, the Bill Gateses of the world, which frankly I could have done without, and, sort of A-list celebrities and politicians who fly in and fly out during the first few days. That's not where the real action happens. The real action happens in those conference rooms where career diplomats are working out the differences and really working to try to come up, in most cases, most of them are working in good faith to try to come up with something meaningful. And in the end, we did get that. We got commitments at COP26 that now cut the warming in half relative to where we were going into the Paris summit of 2016, where we were looking at 4 degrees Celsius, the better part of 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we're looking at potentially under 2 degrees Celsius. And so that's not good enough. We've got to keep warming below 1.5 Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So there's a lot of work left to be done. And, we didn't necessarily get our wish list. We didn't get an agreement among the industrial economies of the world to ban all new fossil fuel infrastructure, to remove all subsidies for fossil fuels, to commit to phasing out coal in particular within the next decade, and support for the developing world so that we can make it economically advantageous to them to leapfrog past the fossil fuel stage. We can't afford for them to make the same mistake that we in the industrial world made. And we have to make it economically feasible for them to skip that stage. And that requires, by some estimates, about $100 billion of assistance a year from the industrial world to the developing countries. And we're still not there yet. And that actually led to some friction. India is frustrated that the support isn't there. And in the end, one of the disappointing things was that they watered down that wording where we were trying to get an agreement that would say phasing out coal. And instead it said phase down, which is a weaker commitment. But in part, that was their frustration that they're not yet getting the support from the industrial world that they need to feel like they can forego this cheap, dirty source of energy, fossil fuels, and go directly to developing clean energy infrastructure. So there are all of these challenges that remain. The good news is we don't have to wait 5 years as we have in the past for the next opportunity. In a year, all of the parties have been requested to meet once again and to see if we can work out some of those differences and get an even stronger agreement.
And of course, the small island nations, they were saying we're drowning already. And while India kind of took most of the news, the bad news at the end of it, they're the ones that are feeling it right now. And there was a lot of disappointment around that too, and then the funding that's needed. And how significant was that last minute move on India's part? Do you think it helped make the COP feel less successful in the end? It felt that way, certainly from an observer point of view, and it wasn't good news. But I had not heard that was sort of the rationale behind it. That maybe they're strategically saying, you can't help us, then we can't commit. And the smaller nations that got less press, I'm sure, feel the same way, except they're not creating as much as India and China, Russia, and the United States are in terms of emissions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not like India came out and stated explicitly. But that's clearly the subtext here, the disappointment on the part of India and other developing countries. Of course, India is now on the cusp of what we would even call it a developing country. And so, this is sort of a rapidly changing landscape. They are obviously producing huge amounts of energy and production. And so, but these are still fraught negotiations between different partners who have different agendas. The developing world that wants, to develop their economies with cheap energy, and they're going to use fossil fuels if we can't make it advantageous for them to use something else. And so then the responsibility falls on the legacy polluters like the United States that have contributed more carbon pollution than any other country. China, of course, is today the largest emitter of carbon pollution, but the United States is the largest cumulative emitter of carbon pollution. And so it's so critical to have both of these countries on board. And that's one of the other sort of pieces of good news here. There was this dampening of enthusiasm, this sort of deflation that we felt at the last minute when that wording got watered down by India in a sort of an action that was probably in violation of parliamentary procedure. There was already an agreement on the table, and they came back at the last minute and sort of forced the hand of the rest of the the countries. If we were going to get an agreement, we needed India to be on board, and so that language had to be watered down. But just a few days earlier, we did have China for the first time commit to phasing down their coal emissions, and the United States and China reached this historic agreement to prioritize climate action. So at the very least, there was the statement coming from the world's two largest polluters that we are committed to doing what's necessary to stave off a catastrophic 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. The whole feeling of the conference, the summit sort of changed at that point. And because there were other positive developments as well. India, despite the criticism for the last minute change in language that they forced, did for the first time commit to reach net zero carbon emissions pretty late in the game, 2070. But keep in mind, we don't all have to reach net zero in 2050 for us to avoid that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. What we need is the planet on the whole to reach net zero at 2050. And that means some of us, like the United States, the EU, the UK, the industrial countries, getting there sooner, and the developing world lagging a bit. And that's understandable because they haven't had 2 centuries of access to cheap fossil fuel energy like the industrial world has. So all of that was in play, and you could look at any one piece of that and find reasons for optimism or pessimism. You have to step back and look at ultimately what came out of the meeting and where our trajectory is now, and it's a much better trajectory than we went into that meeting. Of course, countries now have to make good on their pledges. There is a lot of work to be done, but there was real progress made. And just dismissing the COP process out of hand, and there are, individuals, influential individuals in the larger climate discourse who have said, we've got to get rid of this process. It doesn't work. We're making no progress. That would be catastrophic, because this is the only multilateral process we have for negotiating global climate action. And that sort of talk, I fear, is extremely destructive, and it's seized upon by the forces of inaction, the fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding. In fact, these sort of headlines, these doomist headlines, total failure, COP process broken, none other than Mark Morano.
Yeah.
What's that? COP out? Yeah. Some of the most prominent industry-funded climate change deniers were putting out emails and promoting this framing because they love it. This idea that we failed, that there's no way we can solve this problem, it leads us towards disengagement, which is what they want.
Do they love that more than their children and grandchildren? This is the part.
Apparently, some of them are apparently psychopaths. Yeah.
Seriously, in 2021, that this is still going on. And how angry are you at Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema? And how difficult do you think it was for President Biden? I felt so bad for him coming in handicapped. His hands were literally tied, and he was trying to, walk that tightrope between not, alienating them by blaming them, which would have been appropriate for holding up progress for humanity. And really, how significant do you think that was? Him starting
and the
support he needed.
And some of those same voices that have that have dismissed COP as, a broken process, that no progress was made. We're also attacking Joe Biden when, as you note, he's constrained by Congress right now in what he can do, and a conservative court. What I find, it sort of makes me
him at any turn, including climate change.
yeah, and I'm sort of furious at people who are attacking Joe Biden when it's the conservative courts that we have, in part because many of those progressives chose to stay on the sidelines. There's no difference between Bernie and Hillary Clinton. Many of them decided that. Some of them were weaponized into believing that by Russian psyops, frankly, and an online campaign to depress turnout by progressives. And many of them fell victim to that and didn't vote in that election, or didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in that election. And then we got Donald Trump. And the reason we now have courts that can block Joe Biden at every turn was because of all of those conservative judges that Trump and Republicans were able to load the court with during that 4-year period. And it all comes back to those who, misguidedly believed that there's no difference between the two parties on this issue of climate change, when there is a world of difference. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating then to be hearing from those folks, to be watching some of them attacking Joe Biden, when Joe Biden is constrained by the developments that took place because many of them didn't come out to vote in the last 2 elections.
But let's be fair, most of the attacks are very deliberate. They're coming from the right, Fox and company.
That's right.
And
That's
they're out to destroy his presidency, his legacy, regardless of what he does, regardless of the fact that we have a global crisis that is already here, big time. I mean, that to me, we have such an epic challenge, even without these dark political forces, these so-called conservative, but they're not conserving, our environment, nature,
the planet, for one thing,
planet, humanity. I'm angriest at them. And so before it even gets to the courts, look what's going on in Congress, and
yeah, and so you asked about Joe Manchin. Sure. I mean, it is very frustrating that Manchin and Sinema, 2 Democrats, perhaps in name only, have served as this obstacle to passing the Biden climate agenda, which is absolutely necessary, because we've seen there is a limit to what the chief executive can do, especially when they are opposed by conservative courts. And so we need legislation that will codify these efforts. And thus far, it's been blocked by these 2 Democrats, including a coal state, a red state Democrat, Joe Manchin of West Virginia. We've now seen Build Back Better is passed the House. There seems to be some belief, and I'm not party to these inside negotiations, but there seems to be a belief that Democrats can get 50 votes now to pass that. And then the question will be, what does it look like when it comes out of the Senate? Do we still have those key climate provisions intact? That's what we have to keep an eye on over the next few weeks. And we need to keep the pressure on, because we can't allow Joe Manchin, who has close ties and profits from coal himself, and Kristen Sinema, to block action that is absolutely critical if we are to be able to live up to our negotiations. And if the U.S. can't live up to its obligations rather, then it's very difficult to get these other countries like India and China on board. And so it really does feel like the future of the planet literally hangs in the balance of what happens here in our domestic politics over the next month.
And of course, the planet will be fine. It's all living critters, humans and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, a planet, a thriving planet with
habitable
life.
A habitable, livable planet. Yes.
Yep.
You say Democrats in name only, like Rhino. I guess these are the dinos, as in
right, in more ways than one. Because the dinosaurs lived, during, for example, the early Cretaceous period, when all that carbon was in the atmosphere, and it's the fossil fuel industry that is now mining all that carbon that got buried over 100 million years and putting it back into the atmosphere, recreating the literally the fossil age of that prevailed during the time of the dinosaurs.
I call them dinosaurs. Then
Dinosaurs, there you are.
fossil fuels and all that stuff. As we speak, look what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. 1 in 1,000-year storm, or one in like never before storms. It seems like every time we talk, and like on a weekly basis, someplace in the world, there's some very extreme weather going on, very dangerous, very destructive weather.
Yeah, that's right. And, look at the Pacific Northwest that was baking under this heat dome.
Not long ago.
Let's not forget.
Not long ago.
Not long ago, just a matter of months ago, another 1 in 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, depends on how you look at it. One of these unprecedented events that, brought heat and drought and wildfire, and brought temperatures to southern Canada that rivaled what you would typically see in mid-July in Phoenix, Arizona, a completely unprecedented climate extreme that played out this summer. And now that same region is seeing the other side of the spectrum, the heat and the drought. And then in the winter, when those winter rains come, the atmosphere is warmer, it holds more moisture. So you get more flooding rains like they're experiencing right now in the Pacific Northwest. This is climate change. Make no mistake about it. We are seeing the impacts of climate change play out in real time now, and it will get much worse if we don't act.
And of course, California, where I'm from and currently speaking to you from, of course, the extended drought was horrific for so many areas. The Bay Area, where I'm from, I have friends who lost their homes. Someone lost a ranch in the fires, of course. And then they had a back-to-back interesting weather sequence of atmospheric river a couple of weeks ago with a bomb cyclone, like back-to-back, one day after the next. There were some mudslides. Luckily, it wasn't worse. The hills are all green where I was here in the spring, and everything was brown. And so things feel better. And yet we're very much still in a drought, correct? West Coast.
Yeah, and absolutely. And those mudslides, let's recognize that sometimes these extremes combine in ways that we might not have originally foreseen to give us new types of disasters. You have those wildfires that destroy the vegetation, they destabilize the topsoil. So when you get those flooding winter rains, you get more of these disastrous mudslides. And we're seeing that in California, we're seeing that in Arizona, in the Western US, we're seeing that in Europe. And so this is a reminder that, there are surprises that are in store, but they're not welcome surprises. These extremes can combine to give us new types of disasters. And we're witnessing that here.
Remember Santa Barbara, they had the horrific fires and then horrific mudslides. And
20-something people, I believe, perished in those mudslides.
I believe they haven't even found all the victims. So, I was with a friend yesterday who said, well, is it random, Betsy? I made some reference to like it's coming for all of us. We're all in the path. I said, well, the forces that are, our emissions that are making climate change, a certainty, that part is predictable, other than we are in uncharted territory. I don't have to tell you this. We've never been here before. But I said it's predictable in terms of that it's coming, that it's here, but where it's going to hit, nobody knows. And that's why everyone ought to be concerned, because that those hurricanes that were hitting poor Louisiana, the coast, boom, boom, back to back, what the winds do will determine if it goes left or right, which will determine which town, although I think Port Charles got hit just like boom, 3 times, where it actually hits. So, that's what people need to understand, that that part is not predictable. It's maybe not even avoidable at this point, since we have so much greenhouse gases baked in, but you say we have agency. So I'm not quite finished. I don't want to wrap up here, but just let's stop here for what people can do in terms of agency, because that is the big question, isn't it? And that's also,
Yeah, I mean, so the science over the last decade or so gives us some reason for cautious optimism, because we now understand that the surface of our planet will stop warming up pretty quickly when emissions drop to zero. And so that means there is this direct and immediate impact of our efforts to decarbonize our economy, to bring those carbon emissions to zero. And, it's doable. I mean, the technology exists. I'm sorry, Bill Gates, we don't need a miracle. That's very unhelpful framing, this idea that we need some new technology to solve this problem. No, we don't. We've got it. Wind, solar, geothermal. modern energy storage. We have the tools now to decarbonize our economy. What we lack is the political will to do it. And so we have to make it very clear that there are no technological obstacles to doing this. Right now, the only real obstacles are political, and we can make a difference there. If we turn out in elections and we vote on climate issues and we elect politicians who will do our bidding rather than the bidding of fossil fuel interests, and we change the conversation like those youth climate protesters have been doing, shifting the entire discourse, putting the pressure on polluters, making them, you'll forgive the expression, feel the heat. All of that is important, and it's all doable. And so we need activism, we need policy change, we need people turning out in elections, but we can do it. And this is our time. This is our moment. This is when we have to act.
And in between elections, because they're not every year even, there's a lot people can do, and that is plant-based diet, that is drive the most fuel efficient car you can, don't waste energy, water, food in your home, try to compost, that makes a big difference. And watch green TV and learn about all the environmental issues. We talk about not just climate, but oceans and transportation and food and fuel. And it's all connected. And of course, climate change is the mother of all ecological challenges because it makes them all worse. But I think it's really important for people to educate themselves. And not everybody has the time to read books or watch, long documentaries, great as they are. But that's what we're trying to do here. Like, how do you save the planet? One interview at a time. So, what can I do? Drive an EV, plant a tree, and watch green TV. That's one of our slogans. Really,
do all those things. Let's do everything we can to minimize our own environmental impact, but let's also hold our politicians accountable, because we need them to make the systemic changes that we can't make as individuals. So it's both.
And look at the damage.
All these tools at our disposal.
Look what happened when we had a science denier in the White House for 4 years.
Right.
All the environmental regulations that were rolled back, some 100.
Absolutely.
And there's talk of him running again and winning, over my dead body is what I say, because it will be death.
The planet literally cannot afford that. And I mean the entire planet. I mean, everything on the planet cannot afford another Trump presidency. So let's work, to make sure that we continue to elect enlightened politicians who are willing to act on this defining crisis of our time.
And I'm currently living in Austin, Texas. So my senator is Ted Cruz and my governor is Greg Abbott. And
my condolences to you.
Well, we're part of hopefully the coastal invasion that's going to help blue and green the red state. But I mean, and you saw what happened during, the snowpocalypse in February. We lived through it. It was harrowing as all heck.
Ted Cruz is an example of a climate refugee. Because he left the state for Cancun. Unfortunately, people with resources like Ted Cruz can afford to build fortresses and fly off to other locations. And it's a reminder of just how pernicious some of these, politicians really have become, how hypocritical they are. That they feel,
I call them big fat hypocrites. I'm sorry, like beyond. There should be another word, right?
Yep.
And in the beginning,
let's get them out of office. Let's elect, some climate leaders and
whatever party. They just have to understand science. Unfortunately, there's not nearly enough in the Republican Party. And how about that? Like, no Republicans backing, Build Back Better and the infrastructure. And Kevin McCarthy. Let's just say a word about him. That's chutzpah. Working so hard, so much hot air to make sure that nothing happens, among other things, to fight climate change. I mean, in 2021, isn't it remarkable? We don't have to dwell, but I just like.
Yeah, no, it is, and the good news there is if we all turn out in, a couple elections, in a midterm and a presidential election, in, a couple election cycles, we can change all of this, but we have to turn out. We have to vote.
So glad Better Work is running. We need him.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's unthinkable. Otherwise, right?
Yeah. Otherwise, we get inaction and an agenda that favors, a small number of plutocrats in the fossil fuel industry at the expense of the rest of us.
And we've been saying for some time the window is closing to act on climate, but it really truly is. Right.
It's about this open at this point. There's still a crack, and we have to make sure as I said, this is our moment. This is the make or break moment. These next few years will determine whether or not we're able to avert a catastrophic 1.5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. But there's still time to make sure that we do take the actions necessary. So we just need everybody out there using their voice, using their vote, doing everything they can to affect these changes while it's still possible.
Just a couple more questions. Going back to COP, there was some talk that the Indigenous representation and the youth activists were not included in the blue zone or in the room where leaders were meeting enough. And that was really humiliating. And many of them left dejected. Of course, there was a huge protest, a couple on that Friday and Saturday. But what was your sense of that, and how disheartening must that be for them?
Yeah, without being there, sometimes it's really difficult to know what's really going on there. I mean, obviously, there were these pretty strict restrictions on how many people could be in a room because of COVID. And so that made this different from previous COP meetings. There were these additional constraints. And so without being there and having known what was really going on, I've sort of not really weighed in on that matter, other than to say that it did contribute to this frustration, along with the fact that the single largest delegation was actually fossil fuel executives. There were more fossil fuel executives at that summit and participating in that summit than there were members of any single country. And so all of that contributed to this sense that, the summit was favoring the power brokers over the people, as we put it. And that created a lot of distrust and anger. I have to say, things did start to turn around. And it's important to speak truth to power, and the fact that there were 40,000 youth protesters marching in the streets of Glasgow, I think did put pressure.
One day, rain and wind and, Scottish weather.
Absolutely. I think that made a real difference, and that activism is so important.
Completely agree, of course. So let's take a turn to my favorite subject, which is how the mainstream news media covers climate. And certainly things have improved in the last 6 months even. And you've been everywhere, and that's great to see. And yet there's still no programming, no dedicated ongoing show daily or even weekly on what we're going to do about our planetary pickle. And I think that's the key missing piece, because yes, now they're saying climate change is real, it's here, and they're even talking about it in real time during the deadly weather events, but they always stop at the what can we do about it part. They'll ask you and you'll give your answer, and then they'll go to commercial, and that's the end of it. What's wrong with that? By not having programming that can really connect dots and talk about solutions and give people hope and just understand the science, because all the research shows there are, majority of Americans are concerned and they want to do something. They don't know what to do. And it just blows my mind that there's still no, other than Earth Day and when there's extreme weather and here and there, which is better than it was, but still nothing close to what's needed.
Yeah, as many are fond of saying, every day is Earth Day. Every day should be Earth Day. This is the defining challenge of our time. And so it does seem, bewildering that there isn't mainstream programming that focuses on a regular basis on the defining challenge, the defining crisis of our time. Now, in the UK, Sky News has now instituted a daily climate show, and I've been part of that on several occasions. I have a recurring monthly appearance on that show. And so they are trying to do something like that at Sky News in the UK, which ironically was once owned by Rupert Murdoch. They've come a long way. And unfortunately, Sky News of Australia is still owned by Murdoch, and the Australian Sky News continues to promote climate change denial propaganda. So there is this real dissonance between these two different Sky Newses. That's in the UK. We need something like that here in the United States. And so there really is, I think, the need for a show like that. And I think you are, filling that vacuum. And what we need to make sure is that there is mainstream support and access so that larger and larger audiences can view this programming, because this literally is the most important issue that we face today. And yet it gets so little time, relatively speaking, in the mainstream news cycle.
and this is going to sound like a shameless plug, but if they are going to be wise enough to start programming, they should look for journalists who are actually experienced in this, because you can't learn the climate beat overnight. And it's not just climate. The environmental green beat is something, took me 2 decades to know what I'm talking about. And even that's just this much, because there is so much to learn. But having that communication conduit, that bridge between the scientists, the experts, and the public is so key right now. So thank you for agreeing with me that green TV is filling a green gap, and that's why we want to spread the word, because we hope to go 24/7 and be like GNN, Green News Network, where you can tune in any hour of the day and see these conversations happening. Because I think there is something about seeing live conversations that makes it, more exciting, appealing, and more likely to come back, because we don't have to repeat ourselves. It may sound like we are, but there's so many angles on so many issues and so many experts. And that's, of course, what I've been doing on radio, and it's fun to do it where I can actually see who I'm interviewing. So here we are, the end of 2021. What do you foresee for 2022? And that can be hope, fear, likelihood. We're really we're at a turning point. The good news is, once you really get that we're in a crisis, you can't unget it. Although a couple of politicians, famously John McCain and Mitt Romney, kind of, once they were talking about the climate crisis, then sort of went back on it. But really, you can't. So what do you foresee? If you look in your crystal ball, put on your green glasses, what do you see?
I'm not a fortune teller. I'm just a scientist, but I do do my best to sort of follow the sort of what's happening here, to keep my ear to the ground, and to try to inform myself about what's taking place in policy circles, what's taking place in the business community, the world of finance. They're playing an important role. There is this move in the finance industry away from funding fossil fuel projects, which is playing a really important role. So the business sector is, we talk a lot about the governmental sector, but the business sector has a role to play here as well. So, over the next year, what I anticipate we'll see this Build Back Better plan bill pass the Senate with much of the climate provisions intact. Probably not everything that we would like to see in there, unfortunately.
It already lost
but enough.
The Clean Energy Act was taken out early on. And I wondered how significant that was. And I interrupted you, but if you could just address it.
No problem. Yeah, and so the sort of clean energy standard, which is an important sort of market provision to help level the playing field, so that we move more quickly away from fossil fuel energy. It sort of has a carrot and a stick component to it. And what's been taken away is sort of the stick, the penalties for utilities that don't meet these new standards of providing large and larger shares of electricity from renewable energy. But there is still the carrot: incentives, subsidies for energy producers to produce clean renewable energy and decarbonize the energy sector. There's an expansion of infrastructure for electric vehicles, all sorts of new tax break subsidies for renewable energy, for electric vehicles. So there is enough left in there that the Biden administration can argue that it's meeting its obligations to bring our carbon emissions down by roughly 50% within the next decade. There's enough in there that can be done, along with the action that we're seeing at the state level and the municipal level. West Coast states, for example, joining together to implement their own climate policies, the New England and Mid-Atlantic states doing the same. If you look at everything that's happening now with this sort of headwind, or a tailwind, I should say, rather than the headwind we faced at the national level with climate and renewable energy under the Trump administration, we've now got this tailwind of an administration that is doing what it can through executive actions, where we will get some legislation that'll make a difference. And so with that, the United States can meaningfully say it's living up to its end of the bargain. That's going to be really important over the next year as we continue to meet. And I believe Joe Biden and the Chinese Prime Minister are meeting this week to follow up on their agreement, to talk about what's next. And we're going to need continued discussions, high-level discussions between the US and China and India, the EU, the UK, other players over the next year to make sure that we line things up. So when we do get to that next revisiting of COP26 a year from now, we can get an even more stringent agreement among the countries of the world that does really get us on that path to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's going to depend on what happens in the months ahead, but what we can do as individuals is continue to provide support. Certainly, we've got to turn out in these elections, but to provide support for our politicians who are trying to do the right thing on climate and calling out the bad actors who are simply acting as rubber stamps for polluters. We have to create a political atmosphere that favors the actions by politicians that we need to see.
And one of the things I add, and I do it, my family and friends will tell you, sometimes often to their embarrassment, is speak up. If you see waste happening, like, it's a hot day somewhere and they've got the air conditioning blasting and the doors open, like that's just not okay. Or I was at a motel in New York during a summer a couple of years ago, and they had the fire going, a gas fireplace. It was 80 degrees outside in the middle of the day. Lights are blasting. Like, I think that's all of our responsibility to politely point out that we have a climate crisis and we need to make some changes. And sure enough, nobody complained when they turned off the fire in July, because I checked back when we were checking out, like we do a lot of things because they've been done that way, and that's, I of course see that energy being blasting, air conditioning, heat when it's not needed, whatever, is the emissions being pumped out of still coal-fired power plants, dirty electricity. And don't you think we all need to be ambassadors, because you and I can't be everywhere?
Yeah, no, it's both. It's individual action. There are all these things that we can do as individuals to decrease our environmental impact and our carbon footprint, and we should do these things. In so many cases, they save us money, they make us healthier, they make us feel better about ourselves. Let's do all those things, but most importantly, we have to participate in collective action to put pressure on politicians to make those changes, those systemic changes that we can't make as individuals. Blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, pricing carbon, subsidizing renewable and clean energy. We need politicians as well who will favor those actions, and we need to get rid of those politicians who are standing in the way. So it's all of these things. And, let's do it. This is our time. It's not too late. We know what our mission is.
And it's truly now or never. That sounds like hyperbole, but it really does apply. And thank you so much for all you've been doing for all these years, and we'll continue to do. And let's hope that we can just listen to people who know what's going on and not vote for any more at any level in any party dinosaurs, because the damage is real. The frustration is real, the wasted time is real, and we don't have a second to lose. And just before I let you go, one last question is just, if we decided, let's say all the politicians did wake up and smell the carbon overnight, how long would it take for us to really, I know this is not a small question I'm ending with, but to really transition to, all green power? Like, it's not like it's going to happen overnight, so we ought to start yesterday, right?
Yeah, I mean, there've been, some studies by experts in sort of, energy economics and the energy industry. There are folks like Mark Jacobson of Stanford, who's an engineer who sort of, is an expert on energy systems and renewable and clean energy. And he and other teams of scientists have tackled this question: how quickly can we decarbonize our civilization? And their estimate is we can get 80% of the way there by 2030. We can get to the point where 80% of our energy is provided by renewable and clean energy by 2030, and 100% by 2050 with existing technology. Here's the thing: we will develop new technology. There's no question about that. More efficient solar panels and wind turbines and importantly, forms of energy storage. So we will be able to do better than that. This is a lower bound, in fact, on what we can do, because it assumes no additional innovation, no additional new technology. Just using what we have now, we can get there. And we'll get there even faster because we'll learn by doing. There will be new efficiencies that come about as we move towards this new clean energy infrastructure. And there will be technological innovations that make it even easier. So the reality is we can do this now. That's the answer.
And must. And I would just add that there's no way we're going to cut our emissions in half in less than a decade if we don't have media that is constantly, not just occasionally, talking to experts like you and enlightening the public. And it's empowering, right? Be part of the solution. It feels much better than just, oh, well, we're screwed. And, people who have kids and grandkids are really at a loss. And there's young people deciding not to have children in part because of this. So there's every reason to tune into your environment right now and see what's happening and do everything you can, put a little green spin on whatever it is, whatever area you work in. I encourage young college students to consider they're going into law or journalism, put a green spin on that, because you will be in demand. We have so far to go in terms of sustainable. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Betsy. Always a pleasure.
And I look forward to your next book. I don't know what it's going to be on, but I know you come up with great ones every couple of years. And it's really great to see you continuing to get the word out and urgency and agency. I love that. So hopefully
Thank you. Same to you, my friend.
Hopefully we've given people some things to get into action on. And certainly the urgency is apparent. If not, look out your window. Have a great green day, Michael.
Okay, you too. Thanks.
Thank you.